The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Morrison family home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, casting warm golden rays across the hardwood floors that had been polished to perfection just the weekend before. Sarah Morrison hummed softly as she prepared breakfast, her movements graceful and practiced after 20 years of marriage, and countless mornings spent in this very routine. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, and the smell of bacon filled the air with the promise of another peaceful day in their quiet suburban neighborhood. But as Sarah glanced toward the corner of the kitchen, where her beloved golden retriever usually waited with eager anticipation for breakfast scraps, her humming faltered. Max sat unusually still, his magnificent golden coat somehow lacking its usual luster, despite her careful grooming just 2 days prior. For 8 years, Max had been the beating heart of their home, a gentle giant whose tail could clear a coffee table with enthusiasm, and whose bark could wake the entire neighborhood when the mailman approached. He had been Emma's constant companion through her difficult middle school years, David's jogging partner on weekend mornings, and Sarah's confidant during the long afternoons when the house felt too quiet. But something fundamental had changed in their four-legged family member, and the shift was becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah first noticed the subtle alterations in Max's behavior approximately 3 months ago, though looking back now, she wondered if the signs had been present even earlier. Max, who usually bounded into the kitchen each morning with his tail creating a percussion section against the cabinet doors, had begun approaching his food bowl with a hesitation that seemed almost human in its deliberation. His once bright amber eyes, which had always sparkled with an intelligence that sometimes startled visitors, now seemed clouded with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or anxiety, or something even deeper and more troubling. "Max, come here, boy," Sarah called softly, patting her leg in the gesture that had summoned him countless times before. The dog looked up at her with those same troubled eyes, and for a moment, she could swear she saw something that looked remarkably like sorrow in his gaze. But he remained in his corner, his body language tense and withdrawn, as if an invisible barrier had been erected between him and the family he had once shadowed devotedly throughout every room of their house. The kitchen door swung open as her husband David entered, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man who had performed the same routine for over 2 decades. David Morrison was the type of person who noticed patterns and changes in routine with an almost mathematical precision. His accounting background had trained him to spot discrepancies no matter how small, and lately, the discrepancy in their home had a name: Max. "Still acting strange?" David asked, following Sarah's concerned gaze to their pet. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been watching the same troubling behavior for weeks and was running out of rational explanations. "It's getting progressively worse," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the situation more real and more frightening. "Yesterday afternoon I found him standing in front of the basement door for over an hour, just staring at it and making these soft, whimpering sounds that broke my heart. When I tried to coax him downstairs to retrieve his favorite rope toy, the one he's played with since he was a puppy, he actually backed away from me. David, he looked at me like I was asking him to walk into a fire." David frowned, the expression creating familiar lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years of raising a teenager and managing the stresses of small-town life. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Sarah had prepared, the steam rising from the mug like a question mark in the morning air. "Maybe we should call Dr. Patterson. It's possible this is something medical that we're missing." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs as their 16-year-old daughter, Emma, bounced down with the energy that only teenagers seem to possess before their first cup of coffee. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, and her long brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail that swayed with each step. Emma had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and her father's analytical mind, a combination that had always served her well in school and in her relationships with both humans and animals. "Why does Max look so sad all the time now?" Emma asked, immediately zeroing in on the source of her parents' whispered conversation. She crouched down beside Max and gently stroked his head with the kind of tender care that came naturally to young people who had grown up with pets as siblings rather than possessions. Max allowed the affection, but didn't lean into it the way he used to. There was no tail wagging, no happy panting, no attempt to lick Emma's face or nudge her hand for more attention. Just a resigned acceptance that seemed to break Emma's heart a little more each day. The absence of his usual enthusiastic response to her touch was perhaps more disturbing than any obvious sign of illness might have been. "We're going to take him to see Dr. Patterson very soon," Sarah assured her daughter, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I'm sure it's nothing too serious." But deep down, beneath the maternal instinct to comfort and protect, Sarah felt a growing unease that seemed to expand with each passing day. Dogs, she had read in countless articles and books over the years, were incredibly intuitive creatures. They could sense changes in barometric pressure that predicted storms hours before meteorologists, detect medical conditions in their human companions that doctors might miss, and perceive emotional undercurrents in household dynamics that escaped even the most perceptive family members. What was Max sensing that they weren't? What invisible threat or change had altered his fundamental understanding of his own home? The following weeks brought an escalation in concerning behaviors that transformed their once peaceful household into a source of constant worry. Max began refusing to eat in certain areas of the house, turning away from his food bowl if it was placed anywhere near the basement door or in the laundry room where he had previously enjoyed supervised snacks. He would no longer sleep in his favorite spot by the fireplace in the living room, the worn cushion where he had spent countless evenings basking in the warmth and watching the family's evening routines. Instead, he chose to stay as close to family members as possible, often positioning himself between them and certain doorways in a way that suggested protection rather than companionship. Most disturbing of all, Max had started experiencing what could only be described as anxiety episodes. These would begin without warning, usually in the late afternoon or early evening when the family was settling in for dinner or homework time. His breathing would become rapid and shallow. His body would tremble as if he were cold despite the comfortable temperature of their well-heated home, and he would begin pacing in tight circles, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors in a rhythm that began to haunt Sarah's dreams. During one particularly severe episode, David had attempted to calm Max by speaking in soothing tones and offering his favorite treats, but for the first time in 8 years, Max had refused even the special bacon-flavored biscuits that had never failed to capture his attention. Instead, he had continued his restless pacing until finally collapsing in exhaustion, his sides heaving as if he had just completed a marathon. David's younger brother Michael visited one weekend in early October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air held the crisp promise of autumn. Michael worked as a professional dog trainer and behaviorist in the larger city of Des Moines, and his expertise with canine psychology had made him something of the family expert on all things dog-related. He had been the one to recommend Max's breeder 8 years earlier, and he had helped the Morrison family navigate the challenges of puppyhood with patience and wisdom. But when Michael saw Max's current condition, his usual confident demeanor shifted into something resembling alarm. "This isn't normal behavioral variation," he told David and Sarah as they watched Max refuse to go anywhere near the basement entrance, even when Michael attempted to coax him with professional-grade training treats that had never failed to motivate even the most stubborn dogs. "Something significant is bothering him, and in my 15 years of working with dogs, I've learned that when an animal changes this dramatically, there's usually a concrete reason that we need to identify." "What kind of reason?" Sarah asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Michael scratched his chin thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving Max as the dog stood rigidly at the far end of the hallway, as far from the basement as the architecture of the house would allow. "Could be a medical issue that's causing pain or discomfort, but sometimes dogs react to environmental changes that we can't detect with our limited human senses. Changes in smell that might indicate structural problems, sounds at frequencies we can't hear, even electromagnetic changes that might be affecting his neurological system." That night, Sarah lay awake listening to Max pacing in the hallway outside their bedroom. The soft clicking of his nails against the hardwood had become a familiar soundtrack to her insomnia, a restless rhythm that seemed to echo her own growing anxiety about their beloved pet's condition. David slept fitfully beside her, and she could tell from his breathing patterns that he was also being kept awake by worry. At 3 in the morning, Sarah finally gave up on sleep and padded quietly to the kitchen for a glass of water. She found Max sitting at the top of the basement stairs, perfectly still except for the slight trembling that had become a constant feature of his posture. In the dim light from the hallway, his silhouette looked smaller somehow, as if the weeks of stress and anxiety had physically diminished him. "Max," she whispered, not wanting to wake the rest of the family. "What's wrong, sweet boy?" The dog turned to look at her, and in that moment Sarah would later swear that she saw something remarkably like desperation in his eyes. It was the look of a creature trying desperately to communicate something vitally important, but lacking the words to make himself understood. The next morning brought a development that sent genuine chills down Sarah's spine and convinced her that they could not wait any longer to seek professional help. She had gotten up early to start a load of laundry and found Max in his now familiar position at the top of the basement stairs. But this time, he wasn't just whimpering or showing signs of anxiety. He was growling, a low, threatening sound that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his chest and reverberate through the quiet house, like a warning. "Max?" Sarah called softly, her voice barely audible even to herself. "What's wrong, boy?" The dog turned to look at her, and Sarah gasped audibly. His hackles were raised along his back and neck, his body rigid with a tension that spoke of imminent threat. His lips were pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that he had never shown in aggression during his entire 8 years with their family. For a moment, he looked like a completely different animal, more wild creature than beloved family pet. His eyes held an alertness and intensity that seemed almost primal in its focus. Then, as quickly as the aggressive posture had appeared, it melted away, leaving behind the same anxious, troubled dog they had been living with for months. But the transformation had been so complete and so startling that Sarah found herself backing away involuntarily, her heart racing with a combination of fear and confusion. David found Sarah in the kitchen 20 minutes later, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold her coffee cup steady. The morning sunlight that usually brought her comfort seemed harsh and unforgiving, and she found herself jumping at every small sound. "I'm calling Dr. Patterson this morning," she announced, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even her. "Something is very, very wrong with Max, and I can't spend another day wondering what it might be." Dr. Patterson had been the Morrison family's veterinarian for over a decade, ever since they had moved to Cedar Falls from the larger city where David had started his career. Dr. Patterson was a kind, patient man in his early 60s, who had the rare combination of technical expertise and genuine compassion that made him beloved by both pets and their owners. He had guided Max through puppyhood, helped them navigate the challenges of house training and socialization, and had been present for every vaccination, checkup, and minor injury that was part of responsible pet ownership. When Sarah called the clinic that morning, the obvious distress in her voice prompted Dr. Patterson to rearrange his schedule and fit them in for an appointment that same afternoon. The urgency in her tone had conveyed what words alone could not. This was a family in crisis, and their beloved pet was at the center of a mystery that was consuming their peace of mind. The car ride to the veterinary clinic was perhaps the most tense 30 minutes the Morrison family had experienced together in years. Max, who usually loved car rides and would hang his golden head out the window with pure joy, sat perfectly still in the back seat between David and Emma. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his eyes darted constantly between the windows as if he were watching for some unseen threat. Emma sat beside him with one hand resting gently on his back, whispering words of comfort that seemed to fall on deaf ears. "It's going to be okay, Max," she murmured repeatedly. "Dr. Patterson is going to figure out what's wrong, and then you're going to feel better." But even as she spoke the words, Emma found herself wondering if they were true. What if Dr. Patterson couldn't find anything wrong? What if this was just the beginning of some degenerative condition that would slowly rob them of the Max they had known and loved? Dr. Patterson's waiting room was filled with the usual sounds and smells of a busy veterinary practice. Dogs barking with excitement or anxiety, cats meowing from their carriers, the soft voices of pet owners discussing their animals' various ailments with the practiced patience of the veterinary staff. But Max sat like a statue in the corner where David had positioned him, completely unresponsive to the stimuli that would normally have had him alert and interested in his surroundings. "The Morrison family?" A veterinary technician called from the examination room doorway, her voice cheerful and professional despite the obvious stress radiating from their small group. Dr. Patterson greeted them with his usual warm smile, but Sarah could see the concern already forming in his experienced eyes as he observed Max's behavior during the short walk from the waiting room to the examination area. The dog's posture, his lack of curiosity about the new environment, and his general demeanor all spoke to someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs that animals use to communicate their physical and emotional states. "Tell me everything that's been happening," Dr. Patterson said gently, lifting Max onto the examination table with the careful strength of someone accustomed to handling anxious animals. "Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Sarah and David took turns describing the changes they had witnessed over the past several months. The gradual loss of appetite, the reluctance to eat in certain areas of the house, the anxiety episodes that seemed to come from nowhere, the strange behavior around the basement and other specific locations, and the morning's deeply unsettling growling incident that had convinced Sarah they could wait no longer. Dr. Patterson listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify timeline or specific behaviors. His experienced hands examined Max with gentle precision, checking the dog's ears for signs of infection, looking into his eyes for any abnormalities, examining his mouth and gums for dental issues, and carefully palpating his abdomen to feel for any masses or sources of internal discomfort. He listened to Max's heart and lungs with his stethoscope, took his temperature, and observed his reflexes and responses to various stimuli. Physically, from what I can determine with a basic examination, he seems to be in reasonably good health, Dr. Patterson said thoughtfully, his brow furrowed with concentration. His heart rate is elevated, which is consistent with chronic stress or anxiety. His breathing is somewhat shallow, again suggesting ongoing anxiety. But I don't feel any obvious masses. His temperature is normal, and his basic reflexes appear intact. Could it be a brain tumor? Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. The possibility had been haunting her thoughts for weeks, ever since she had researched canine behavioral changes online and discovered the various serious conditions that could cause personality alterations in dogs. It's certainly within the realm of possibility, Dr. Patterson admitted, his honesty tempered with gentle compassion. But let's not jump to the most serious conclusions immediately. I'd like to run some comprehensive tests first. We'll start with blood work to check his organ function and look for any signs of infection or metabolic issues. And I think we should do some imaging studies to rule out any internal problems that might be causing discomfort or neurological symptoms. The blood draw was routine, though Max barely seemed to notice the brief discomfort of the needle. His usual sensitivity to medical procedures had been replaced by an almost eerie compliance that worried Dr. Patterson almost as much as his behavioral symptoms. A healthy, anxious dog would typically show some reaction to the stress of veterinary procedures, but Max seemed to exist in a state of resigned endurance that suggested he was already dealing with significant ongoing discomfort. The blood work results were available within 2 hours, and they showed values that were largely within normal ranges. Max's kidney function was good, his liver enzymes were normal, and there were no signs of infection or obvious metabolic disorders. While this was relief in one sense, it also deepened the mystery of what was causing such dramatic behavioral changes in a dog who appeared to be physically healthy. I'd like to take some x-rays, Dr. Patterson suggested after reviewing the blood work results with the family. Sometimes dogs can experience pain or discomfort from issues that aren't immediately apparent during a physical examination. Internal injuries, arthritis in the spine, or even foreign objects in the digestive system can cause behavioral changes that might seem unrelated to their physical cause. The X-ray process required Max to be sedated, something that normally would have concerned Sarah greatly. She had always been protective of Max during medical procedures, worried about the risks associated with anesthesia and the stress of unfamiliar medical environments. But the dog was so withdrawn and compliant that he barely seemed to notice as the veterinary technician prepared him for the imaging studies. The Morrison family waited in Dr. Patterson's office while the X-rays were being taken, each lost in their own worried thoughts and worst-case scenarios. Emma sat curled in one of the chairs, her arms wrapped around her knees as she tried to process the possibility that Max might have some serious underlying condition. David paced the small office, his analytical mind running through every possible explanation for Max's behavior, and coming up empty. Sarah simply sat and stared at the diplomas and certificates on Dr. Patterson's wall, trying to distract herself from the growing certainty that their beloved pet was suffering from something far more serious than simple anxiety. 25 minutes later, Dr. Patterson emerged from the back room where the imaging equipment was located. His expression was grave in a way that immediately put the entire family on alert. The usual warm smile was absent, replaced by the serious demeanor of a medical professional who had discovered something unexpected and troubling. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked Sarah and David, his eyes flicking meaningfully toward Emma in a way that suggested the conversation might not be appropriate for teenage ears. "I want to hear whatever you have to say," Emma insisted, her voice stronger than she felt. "Max isn't just my parents' dog. He's been my best friend for 8 years, and I deserve to know what's wrong with him." Dr. Patterson hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the wisdom of including a 16-year-old in what was obviously going to be a difficult conversation. But the determination in Emma's voice and the united front presented by the Morrison family convinced him that this was not a decision he should make for them. "All right," he said finally. "But I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you is quite unusual and very disturbing. In 30 years of veterinary practice, I've only encountered something like this a handful of times, and each instance has stayed with me because of the implications involved." He led them to his computer, where the X-ray images were displayed on a large monitor that usually showed routine images of broken bones, dental problems, or the occasional swallowed toy. But the image that appeared on the screen made the Morrison family stare in confusion and growing horror. To their untrained eyes, the X-ray initially looked like a normal image of a dog's digestive system. They could make out the familiar shapes of ribs, spine, and the shadowy outlines of internal organs. But Dr. Patterson pointed to a specific area with his pen, and suddenly the image took on a sinister clarity that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Do you see these objects here?" he asked, indicating several small bright white spots scattered throughout Max's stomach and intestinal tract. The objects stood out clearly against the darker shadows of soft tissue, looking like tiny stars in a night sky that should not have contained any light at all. "What are they?" David asked, leaning forward to get a better look at the screen. His accounting background had trained him to examine details carefully, but nothing in his experience had prepared him to interpret medical images or understand their implications. Dr. Patterson's expression darkened further as he adjusted the contrast on the image to make the foreign objects even more visible. They appear to be small metal objects of various shapes and sizes, multiple pieces, which strongly suggests they weren't swallowed accidentally during normal play or exploration. Based on their size, shape, and the fact that there are so many of them distributed throughout his digestive system, I believe someone has been deliberately feeding Max small metal objects over an extended period of time. The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound and terrible. Sarah felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room, leaving her unable to breathe or think clearly. The words seemed to echo in her mind without making complete sense, as if Dr. Patterson had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. "What do you mean, deliberately?" Sarah whispered, though part of her already understood exactly what he meant and was simply refusing to accept the horrific implications. "I mean that someone has been intentionally giving Max small pieces of metal to swallow, probably mixed with food or treats so that he wouldn't notice or refuse them. These objects have been causing internal irritation, pain, and potentially dangerous blockages throughout his digestive system. This would explain all of the behavioral changes you've been observing. Max has been suffering for months, and his anxiety and distress have been his only way of trying to communicate that something was seriously wrong." Emma burst into tears, the sound of her sobs filling the small office and expressing the horror that words seemed inadequate to convey. "Who would do something like that to Max?" she cried. "Who could be so cruel to an innocent animal?" The implications of Dr. Patterson's discovery hit the Morrison family like a series of physical blows, each realization more devastating than the last. Someone they trusted, someone who had regular access to their home and their beloved pet, had been systematically and deliberately poisoning Max with metal objects over a period of months. The betrayal felt almost too enormous to comprehend, undermining their basic assumptions about safety, trust, and the reliability of the people in their lives. "Could this cause permanent damage to his health?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with shock and barely controlled panic. "If we don't remove these objects soon, absolutely," Dr. Patterson replied with the honesty that his profession demanded. "Metal objects in the digestive system can cause intestinal blockages that require emergency surgery, perforations that can lead to life-threatening infections, or gradual damage to the intestinal lining that could have long-term consequences for his health. Max has been incredibly resilient to endure this for as long as he has, but we need to act quickly to prevent more serious complications." David's mind immediately began racing through the possibilities, his analytical nature kicking in as a defense against the emotional chaos of the situation. Who had regular access to their home? Who could have been feeding Max without their knowledge or supervision? The list of people who could have committed such an act was terrifyingly short, and included only individuals they had trusted implicitly. "How long would this have been going on?" David asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Based on the number of objects I can see in the imaging and their distribution throughout his digestive system, I would estimate this has been happening over a period of several months." The objects appear to have been ingested gradually over time, which is why the symptoms developed slowly and why it took so long for the situation to become critical. The drive home from the veterinary clinic was conducted in complete silence, except for Emma's quiet sobs in the back seat. Max, still groggy from the sedation used during the X-ray procedure, lay beside her, finally peaceful for the first time in months. Dr. Patterson had scheduled emergency surgery for the following morning to remove the metal objects, but the emotional damage to the family felt irreparable and permanent. Sarah found herself looking at Max with a mixture of overwhelming love and heartbreaking guilt. How long had he been suffering while they tried to rationalize away his obvious distress? How many nights had he paced the hallways in pain, while they assumed he was simply being anxious about normal household noises? The thought that they had failed to protect him from months of deliberate cruelty was almost unbearable. At home, Sarah walked through their house with completely new eyes, seeing every room and every corner as a potential crime scene. The kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals, the living room where they had spent countless peaceful evenings, the basement that had become a source of such obvious terror for Max. All of these familiar spaces now felt tainted by the knowledge that someone had been using their home as a venue for systematic animal cruelty. David called his office to inform them that he would need to take several days off for a family emergency, citing personal reasons that he couldn't bring himself to explain in detail. As he hung up the phone, a thought struck him that made his blood run cold and his hands tremble with a combination of rage and disbelief. "Sarah," he called to his wife, who was sitting on the living room couch staring blankly at the wall. "We need to approach this systematically and think about this logically, even though every instinct we have is telling us to react emotionally. Who has been in our house regularly over the past few months? Who would have had the opportunity and access necessary to do something like this?" Sarah looked up, her eyes red with tears and exhaustion. The question forced her to confront the reality that someone in their trusted circle had betrayed them in the most cruel way imaginable. "The usual people, I suppose. Your brother Michael when he visits. My sister Janet when she comes for dinner. The cleaning lady who comes every other week. The teenagers from down the street that Emma babysits for when they drop off their kids. What about service people? Contractors or repair workers? The plumber who fixed the kitchen sink last month. The cable technician who came to upgrade our internet service. The heating repairman who serviced the furnace before winter. But those were all single visits, and you said this has been going on for months." Emma joined them in the living room, having composed herself enough to think clearly about the horrible situation they were facing. "What about Mrs. Henderson?" she suggested quietly, her voice still shaky from crying. Mrs. Henderson was their elderly neighbor, who lived in the house directly next to theirs. She was in her late 70s, a widow who had lived alone since her husband's death 5 years earlier. The Morrison family had a key to her house for emergencies, and she had a key to theirs for the same purpose. She often stopped by to water plants when they were out of town, check on the house during extended absences, and had been known to give Max treats and attention when she encountered him in the yard or during her frequent visits. Mrs. Henderson would never intentionally hurt Max, Sarah said immediately, though her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to project. "She's always loved animals. She had 3 cats before they passed away, and she's always been so kind to Max." But David wasn't so sure, and the more he thought about it, the more concerned he became. Over the past year, Mrs. Henderson had been showing subtle but increasingly noticeable signs of cognitive decline. Her family lived several states away and only visited occasionally, so the Morrison family had become informal caregivers, checking on her regularly and helping with small tasks around her house. There had been several incidents that had worried them, finding her outside in her nightgown on cold mornings, discovering that she had left her stove on for hours, and noting that she sometimes seemed confused about what day it was, or whether she had already eaten. "What if she's been giving Max things without realizing they're harmful?" David suggested gently, though the words felt terrible to speak. "What if her cognitive issues have progressed to the point where she doesn't understand the difference between appropriate treats and dangerous objects?" The possibility hung in the air like a dark cloud, terrible in its implications, but offering at least a partial explanation for the inexplicable cruelty that had been inflicted on their beloved pet. If Mrs. Henderson was experiencing dementia or some other form of cognitive impairment, she might genuinely believe she was helping Max, while being completely unaware that she was causing him serious harm. That evening, after a sleepless afternoon spent researching cognitive decline and its effects on judgment and reasoning, David decided he needed to speak with Mrs. Henderson directly. The conversation would be difficult and potentially heartbreaking, but they needed to understand what had happened to Max and why. He found her in her backyard garden just before sunset, tending to her roses with the methodical care that had made her yard the envy of the neighborhood for decades. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a smile that seemed genuine and lucid, showing no signs of the confusion or agitation that might indicate severe cognitive impairment. "David, how wonderful to see you," she said warmly, straightening up from the rose bush she had been pruning. "How are Sarah and Emma? And how is sweet Max? I haven't seen him in a few days, which is unusual. He usually comes to visit me every afternoon when I'm working in the garden." David studied her carefully, looking for signs of confusion, deception, or any indication that she was aware of having done something wrong. But her demeanor seemed completely normal, even concerned about Max's absence from their usual routine. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you something very important, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, we're not angry with you. Have you been giving Max any treats or special food lately?" Her expression became thoughtful rather than defensive, and she nodded enthusiastically. "Well, yes, of course I have. I always give him something special when I see him. That sweet dog has been such a comfort to me since Harold passed away. Max has become like family to me, and I love spoiling him a little bit." "What kind of treats have you been giving him?" Mrs. Henderson's face brightened with obvious pride and affection. "Oh, they're very special treats that I make myself. It's a recipe I learned from my grandmother when I was just a little girl. She taught me that dogs need extra nutrition to keep their coats shiny and their teeth strong. So I've been making special cookies that are much better for Max than those store-bought treats that don't have any real nutritional value." David felt his heart beginning to sink, but he pressed on with the conversation. "Can you tell me what ingredients you use in these special cookies?" "Oh, it's quite simple, really. I start with a base of flour and water to hold everything together, and then I add the special ingredients that my grandmother taught me about. Dogs need minerals in their diet, much more than most people realize. So I add little bits of metal and other hard materials to make the cookies extra crunchy and nutritionally complete." The revelation hit David like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm and continue the conversation. "What kind of metal pieces do you add, Mrs. Henderson?" "Oh, all sorts of useful things," she replied with obvious enthusiasm for sharing what she clearly believed was valuable knowledge. "I save small screws and washers from around the house, little pieces of jewelry that I don't wear anymore, paper clips that I cut into smaller pieces, sometimes coins if I have extras. My grandmother always said that dogs in the wild would get these minerals from gnawing on rocks and metal objects they found. So domestic dogs need us to provide these nutrients for them." David felt sick to his stomach, but he could see that Mrs. Henderson genuinely believed she was providing excellent care for Max. Her cognitive decline had apparently affected her ability to distinguish between helpful and harmful actions, while leaving her feeling of affection for Max completely intact. "Mrs. Henderson," David said gently, "I need to explain something very important to you. Metal objects can be very dangerous for dogs. They can't digest metal the way they can digest food, and when dogs eat metal, it can make them very sick." At first, Mrs. Henderson seemed confused and defensive, insisting that her grandmother had successfully fed metal scraps to their farm dogs for decades without any problems. But as David patiently explained Max's symptoms and the discovery of the metal objects in his digestive system, he could see understanding and horror gradually dawning in her eyes. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth as the full implications of what she had been doing became clear. "I was trying to help him. I thought I was giving him the best possible care. I would never intentionally hurt that sweet dog. He means the world to me." Tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks as she realized that her loving intentions had been causing months of suffering for the animal she cared about so deeply. "I've been making him sick? All this time I thought I was helping him stay healthy and strong." David spent the next hour sitting with Mrs. Henderson in her garden, gently explaining the situation and helping her understand that her actions, while well-intentioned, had been harmful. The conversation was heartbreaking for both of them, as it became clear that Mrs. Henderson's cognitive decline had progressed much further than anyone had realized. The surgery the following morning lasted 3 hours, considerably longer than Dr. Patterson had initially anticipated. The complexity of removing multiple metal objects from throughout Max's digestive system required careful navigation to avoid causing additional damage to his intestinal lining. Dr. Patterson emerged from the operating room looking exhausted, but cautiously optimistic. "We were able to remove 17 separate metal objects," he reported to the anxious Morrison family, who had been waiting in the clinic's lobby since early morning. Small screws, paper clips, pieces of jewelry, coins, and several other unidentifiable metal fragments. Some of them had been in his system long enough to cause significant irritation and minor damage to his intestinal walls, but nothing that won't heal with proper care and time. The recovery process would be lengthy and require careful monitoring, but Dr. Patterson was optimistic that Max would make a complete recovery without any permanent damage to his digestive system. The dog would need to stay at the clinic for several days for observation, followed by weeks of restricted activity and a carefully controlled diet at home. The Morrison family faced a series of difficult decisions in the days following Max's surgery. While they were relieved to understand what had happened to their beloved pet, they also recognized that Mrs. Henderson was clearly experiencing significant cognitive decline that required immediate attention and professional care. Sarah spent an emotional afternoon with Mrs. Henderson's daughter, who lived in Nebraska and had been unaware of the extent of her mother's confusion and memory loss. The conversation was difficult, as it required explaining not only what had happened to Max, but also the clear evidence that Mrs. Henderson could no longer live safely alone. "I had no idea things had gotten this bad," Mrs. Henderson's daughter said, her voice filled with guilt and regret. "Mom has always been so independent, and when I called her, she seemed fine. She never mentioned being confused or having trouble with daily tasks." Within a week, arrangements were made for Mrs. Henderson to move into an assisted living facility in Nebraska, closer to her daughter and grandchildren. The facility specialized in caring for individuals with dementia and cognitive decline, and they assured the family that Mrs. Henderson would receive the supervision and medical care she needed while still maintaining as much independence as possible. The day before Mrs. Henderson was scheduled to move, she asked if she could visit Max one final time. Dr. Patterson had agreed to allow the visit, though he supervised carefully to ensure that the interaction was safe and beneficial for both the recovering dog and the confused elderly woman. Max, still weak from surgery but already showing signs of his old personality returning, approached Mrs. Henderson cautiously. The months of inadvertent poisoning had clearly affected his trust, but when she knelt down and spoke to him in the gentle tones he remembered from their garden visits, his tail gave a tentative wag. "I'm so sorry, sweet boy," Mrs. Henderson whispered, tears streaming down her face as she gently stroked his head. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was helping you stay healthy and strong. I love you so much and I would never intentionally cause you pain." Watching this interaction, Sarah felt her anger and fear transform into something more complex and ultimately more healing, genuine compassion. Mrs. Henderson's actions had been horrifying in their consequences, but they had originated from a place of love and care, however misguided by cognitive decline. The elderly woman's distress at learning she had hurt Max was completely genuine, and her love for the animal had never wavered, even when her judgment had become dangerously impaired. Over the following weeks, as Max continued to recover and gradually return to his normal, joyful self, the Morrison family reflected extensively on the lessons learned from their ordeal. They had discovered that sometimes the greatest threats to those we love can come from the most unexpected places, and that good intentions without proper understanding or cognitive capacity can lead to devastating consequences. They also learned about the critical importance of community involvement and looking out for vulnerable members of society, particularly elderly individuals who might be experiencing cognitive decline in isolation. Mrs. Henderson's family had been genuinely unaware of the extent of her confusion and memory loss, and her geographic isolation from close relatives had allowed the situation to develop and worsen without adequate oversight or intervention. The Morrison family made a commitment to stay more connected with their elderly neighbors and to watch for signs that someone might need additional support or care. They realized that what had happened to Max could have been prevented if Mrs. Henderson's cognitive decline had been identified and addressed earlier. Emma, who had been particularly affected by the experience, began volunteering at the local animal shelter and started an educational campaign at her high school to teach other teenagers about proper pet care, the signs of animal distress, and the importance of advocating for animals who cannot speak for themselves. Her experience with Max had taught her that being a voice for those who are vulnerable and cannot protect themselves is one of the most important responsibilities any person can undertake. "Animals depend on us completely," she told her classmates during a presentation about responsible pet ownership. "They trust us to take care of them, And when that trust is betrayed, even accidentally, the consequences can be devastating. We have to be their protectors and advocates because they can't protect themselves. Max's full recovery took approximately 8 weeks, during which time the Morrison family learned to read his subtle communications more carefully and to trust their instincts when something seemed wrong. The day Dr. Patterson declared him completely healthy was a celebration that involved the entire family, several neighbors, and even some of Emma's friends who had followed Max's story with concern and support. Max seemed to sense their joy and relief, and for the first time in months he bounded around the backyard with his tail wagging furiously, chasing butterflies and barking at squirrels with the pure, uncomplicated happiness that had been absent from their lives for far too long. His golden coat had regained its lustrous shine, his eyes sparkled with renewed curiosity and contentment, and his appetite had returned with enthusiasm that sometimes required the family to monitor his food intake to prevent him from eating too quickly. That evening, as the family sat together in their living room for the first time in months without the underlying tension and worry that had characterized the previous season, Max curled up contentedly at their feet, finally at peace in his own home. The basement, which had been a source of such obvious terror during his illness, no longer seemed to hold any fear for him, and he had even retrieved his favorite toys from the storage area without any signs of anxiety. Sarah reflected on how the experience had fundamentally changed their family's approach to relationships, community involvement, and their understanding of the responsibilities that come with caring for vulnerable beings. "You know," she said, looking down at Max, whose breathing had settled into the peaceful rhythm of contented sleep. "In a strange way, this whole terrible experience has made us stronger as a family and more aware as community members." David nodded thoughtfully, his arm around Emma, who was reading a book about animal psychology that she had checked out from the library. "We've learned to pay attention to subtle signs when something isn't right, to trust our instincts about the people and animals we care about, and to never take the well-being of those we love for granted." Emma looked up from her book, her eyes still showing traces of the maturity that the experience had forced upon her. "And we've learned that sometimes protecting the people and animals we care about means having difficult conversations and making hard decisions, even when those decisions affect people we care about." The Morrison family's story spread through their small community, serving as a powerful reminder about the importance of mental health awareness, particularly among elderly residents who might be living alone without adequate support systems. Several families in Cedar Falls reported that the story had prompted them to check more carefully on aging relatives and neighbors, leading to the identification of other individuals who needed additional care and supervision. Mrs. Henderson, now receiving proper medical care and supervision at the assisted living facility in Nebraska, was evaluated by specialists who confirmed that she was experiencing moderate to severe dementia that had likely been developing for several years. She was treated with medications designed to slow the progression of her cognitive decline and began participating in therapy programs designed to help individuals with dementia maintain their sense of dignity and purpose while living safely in a supervised environment. While Mrs. Henderson never fully regained her previous mental clarity, she found peace in knowing that Max had recovered completely and that her unintentional harm had been forgiven by the Morrison family. Her daughter visited regularly and brought photos and updates about Max's recovery, which seemed to bring Mrs. Henderson genuine comfort and relief from the guilt she felt about her actions. 3 months after Max's surgery, Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her daughter called the Morrison family to inform them of her mother's death and to express gratitude for their compassion and understanding during such a difficult situation. At Mrs. Henderson's funeral, the Morrison family was among the attendees, and Sarah spoke briefly about how their neighbor's genuine love for animals, despite its tragically misguided expression during her final months of independence, had taught them all about the complexity of human nature and the importance of compassion in difficult circumstances. Mrs. Henderson loved Max deeply, Sarah told the small gathering of family and friends. Her actions during her illness were not representative of who she was as a person or how she felt about animals. She was a kind, caring woman whose judgment was compromised by a disease that affects millions of families. We choose to remember her for the love she showed our family and our pet, not for the confusion that caused her to express that love in harmful ways. The experience with Max and Mrs. Henderson became a defining moment for the Morrison family, shaping their approach to relationships, community involvement, and their understanding of the responsibility they had to care for both animals and elderly community members who might be vulnerable to exploitation or neglect. They established a small foundation in Mrs. Henderson's memory, dedicated to providing education about responsible pet care and supporting families dealing with elderly relatives experiencing cognitive decline. The foundation offered workshops about recognizing the signs of dementia, resources for families navigating the challenges of caring for aging parents, and educational materials about animal welfare and protection. Years later, when people asked the Morrison family about the most important lesson they had learned from their ordeal, the answer was always the same: that love, in all its forms, requires knowledge, vigilance, and sometimes the courage to intervene when something isn't right, even when that intervention is difficult or uncomfortable. Max's suffering had been real and significant, but it had also revealed the depth of connection possible between humans and animals, and the profound responsibility that comes with caring for vulnerable beings who depend entirely on human judgment and protection for their safety and well-being. Max lived for many more happy years with the Morrison family, becoming something of a local celebrity for his remarkable recovery and resilience. His story was featured in veterinary journals as an example of how early intervention and proper medical care could reverse even severe cases of accidental poisoning, and his case became part of the curriculum at the state veterinary school, as an illustration of the importance of considering all possible causes when diagnosing unusual behavioral changes in pets. More importantly for the Morrison family, Max's experience served as a lasting reminder that vigilance, compassion, and community awareness are essential components of creating safe environments for all living beings, both human and animal. The basement of the Morrison house, which had been the source of so much anxiety for Max during his illness, was eventually converted into a comfortable family room, where Max loved to nap in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through new windows David had installed specifically to make the space more welcoming. It seemed symbolically appropriate that a place once associated with fear and anxiety had been transformed into a space of comfort and peace, much like the family's understanding of their experience had evolved from trauma to wisdom and purpose. Emma went on to study veterinary medicine in college, inspired by her experience with Max and her desire to protect animals who couldn't protect themselves. She specialized in animal behavior and became an advocate for elderly pet owners who might need additional support in providing appropriate care for their animals. David and Sarah became active in local organizations focused on supporting elderly community members, and they developed an informal network of neighbors who checked regularly on older residents to ensure they had the support and resources they needed to live safely and independently for as long as possible. In the end, the Morrison family's story was not just about a dog who became mysteriously ill, but about the complex nature of human relationships, the challenges of aging and cognitive decline, and the profound responsibility we all share to protect and care for the vulnerable members of our communities, both human and animal. It was a story about how tragedy could be transformed into purpose, how suffering could lead to greater understanding and compassion, and how the love between a family and their pet could inspire positive change that extended far beyond their own home and into their entire community. Max's complete recovery was a testament to the resilience of animals and the power of proper medical care, but the lessons learned from his suffering would last much longer than his physical healing. The experience taught everyone who heard their story that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most difficult experiences, and that healing, both physical and emotional, is possible when communities come together with understanding, compassion, and a shared commitment to doing better for all their members. The Morrison family never forgot that their story could have had a much different ending if they had not trusted their instincts about Max's distress, if Dr. Patterson had not been thorough in his diagnostic approach, or if they had not approached Mrs. Henderson's involvement with compassion rather than anger. Their experience reminded them daily that the difference between tragedy and recovery often lies in the willingness of people to pay attention, ask difficult questions, and act with both courage and kindness when faced with situations that challenge their assumptions about safety and trust. For Max, the ordeal became nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by years of continued love, play, and the simple contentment that comes from being a cherished member of a family that had learned to appreciate every ordinary day as a gift. His recovery served as a daily reminder to the Morrison family that resilience is possible, that healing can occur even after serious harm, and that the bonds between humans and animals can survive and even grow stronger in the face of challenges that might seem insurmountable. The golden retriever, who had once paced their hallways in distress, now slept peacefully by their fireplace, his breathing deep and contented, his dreams undisturbed by the memories of those months when he had suffered in silence, trying desperately to communicate a danger that his beloved family could not yet understand. His recovery was complete, but his story continued to inspire others to pay closer attention to the subtle communications of those who depend on them for protection and care.